I'm Inger Flem. I'm a second year student here in the CSLC program, Spanish track. And today I'm very happy to present the keynote speaker, Pablo Oyarzún. Pablo Oyarzún is Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Interdisciplinary Center of Studies in Philosophy, Arts and Humanities at the University of Chile. He is also a Director of the Central Seminar of Research at the Institute of Arts of the Pontifical Catholic University of Valparaiso, la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaiso. With more than 400 publications, his work focuses on the topics of metaphysics and ontology, moral and political philosophy, epistemology, philosophy of language, aesthetics, and theory of arts and literature, education, and culture. At the University of Chile, he has served as Vice Dean between 1991 and 94, and Dean of the Faculty of Arts between 2003 and 2010, and he is currently Executive Director of the Bicentennial Initiative for the Revitalization of Humanities, Arts, Social Sciences, and Communication. In 2019, he joined the International Advisory Board of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes. And today's talk by Pablo is titled "The Land Where Nothing Happened."
I'm absolutely grateful to be here. And I, of course, with all of you, and I want to heartily thank my dear friend Erin for the invitation, and of course all the group, the organizing group of this meeting. I won't speak in English. As Erin said a few moments ago, I will read in Spanish. I was gathering some notes. I've written down the last 2 or 2.5 months about the situation in Chile. I think it has something to do with transmediality. I'm just going to present some instances which could be maybe perhaps thought of or reflected upon in a transmedia way, but they are all simply instances. It's more about the politics, I would say. I'm recalling this wonderful book by Kantorowicz. It's called The King's Two Bodies. I would say a politics of the people's multiple bodies. That's more or less my theme of today. So, apologizing again for not speaking in English, I begin. Well, that's the title. It's "The Land Where Nothing Happens." In Spanish, we can say it basically nada pasa, va? It's present and perfect. And well, this is what I'm going to read now. I've lost it. It is.
No one in Chile has been exempt from saying, or confessing rather, how unforeseen was the social outburst that began on October 18th, stimulated by the secondary school Mobilization, high school students, that put out a call to evade the metro fare increase in Santiago, that had faced a fare increase for the past 2 years. Different voices have offered their hypotheses and diagnostics. Some of them have been characterized by using general interpretations based on premises that they had given undisputable credit to. However, I have the impression that these are the furthest away from understanding what has happened and continues happening. There is a feature that I think characterizes all of them, characterizes them more or less, but it is a common feature. Rather, if their fuel is maladaptation, arrogance, or euphoria, they concur in reading the event with things they already know. In other words, they apply a conceptual blueprint that has already been secured. I use the word event on purpose, not because I want to burden it, not like contraband with dense theory, but because Calling it thus has the virtue of saying that it has the strength of disconcerting the frameworks that we're used to using to apply to what happens. I'm not just talking about an event with potential historical implications. I'm talking about any kind of event, that is, contingency as mode and rhythm of what happens, that always has, however small or discrete as it might be, the strength to force us to think, to try to understand and do or omit something about it. Oftentimes, the event can be lodged inside some kind of pre-existing framework that we already have. The point is that the event that we're talking about offers greater resistance to this kind of integration in philosophy, but certainly not just in it, but at the beginning, in every attempt to know and understand. We must be habituated, or we must at least foresee a determined fact or a determined circumstance that offers resistance to the schema that we usually use. So this could suggest us to have a thorough reevaluation of these same schemas that we're mentioning. We're speaking about an operatic movement, doubt, critique. It's about suspending inertia in these schema. Going back to the tabula rasa, to put it another way, the first step is to confess to oneself that you don't know what's happening. Not understanding is not a closing. It's not a close, it's the beginning of an opening. And it's important to be patient, to be able to gently see the features of the event. In and of themselves as such, indicators of different lines of sight, only some of which will be able to converge. It's about perceiving and thinking. Before else, pay attention to what's happening. In the simplest, plainest, most holistic way, I think that mobilizations, protests, and demands that have happened incessantly recently in Chile concentrate on something like a logically impeccable collective inference. We suffer permanently from abuse. We have to change the rules of the game. This is the sense of the overwhelming demand for a new constitution has, as well as the General Assembly process happening currently in the country, which has been decided on by the people, as well as the demand for specific and very urgent measures that allow to compensate for the harsh sting that abuse has imposed on so many lives, pushing them to the limits of subsistence. Abuse. We are indebted to the feminist mobilization. The march and convergence of 400,000 women on March 8, 2019, this left things clear. It began something. It pushed us to understand what the word implies, what its multiple variants imply, until it reaches the furthest corners of the life. How this word denominates the misery that we experience in life, not that which resists, but that which is imposed on us, changing the rules, redesigning the fields of conflict, of interest, of demands. This is more or less already implied in mobilization. Maybe because its agents were women, we weren't able to read its full reach. But it's not just about this inference, recognizing this inference. In the node of social uprising, it's also, in all of its tangle, about the multiplicity of forms it has taken on and continues to take on. We have to pay attention to that. Okay, got it. This has to do with the feminist movement. So number one. Everything is recorded. Takeovers, stretches, moments, events, instant, everything, the multiple outbursts and flashes of the social outburst, of the event. And I'll write it with a capital letter only one time, just to indicate its power, its particular plural unity, and its shared singularity in its movement. I'm interested in interrogating this plural unity and the shared singularity that I think I see in it. Preserving the foundation, the neoliberal foundations imposed by the dictatorship during all of the transitional period, without setting aside the efforts made to reduce poverty and to recover social rights, kept the nucleus intact of these very same bases. It's not about the normative frameworks backed by the mortgage represented by what we called at that time the powers that be, given enough power to intervene in any relevant decision for the country. It was about, and it is about, the systematic reproduction of determining all aspects of social life through a market robbed of any regulation that allows it to protect, not to mention increase these very same social rights. The greatest result was the significant increase of the middle class. You would think that an expansion of the middle class, with the incorporation of these sectors that could leave the precarious or poor socioeconomic conditions, could give society greater stability, because these are sectors that have reached a baseline level of well-being. And they tend to adhere to the current system and not sympathize with major changes to it, because these could affect precisely this well-being. In this sense, from the point of view of the system, said expansion is the fodder of the self-same reproduction and perpetuation. However, in the case of Chile, achieving these minimum wellness standards was achieved on the base of debt. It was only possible to access goods and services, healthcare, education, property, furniture, cars, everything, by going into economic commitments long-term that were soon revealed to be too onerous to make resources available, largely intended for basic needs. Additionally, there was the short-sighted social planning that, because of its conditions and restrictions, left retirees and the elderly abandoned or with miserable pensions below the poverty line. As a result, large sectors of the middle class have been forced to live, who were supposed to guarantee the system, have been forced to live in quotidian fear because of the constant fear of surviving from one month to the other. It's a new kind of fear, it's important to say, not less sensible than that other intense, corrosive, and lacerating one that reigned during the years of the dictatorship, precisely as if, or because, its main fuel is fear. In fact, the system, or the model, however you want to call it, this is not important for me right now, it works in a closed circle of fear and safety. The need for safety feeds off of fear, uncertainty, threat. It's the reason why crime, regardless of statistics demonstrating a decrease, why it turns into a cardinal factor for right-wing discourse. It requires the population to vaguely feel the hurt, the pang of fear, for have anxiety turn to safety as a last resort, as an internalized psychosocial last result. So the discourse doesn't work unless the media reinforces this content day by day. But perhaps it's difficult if this fear, not generically, is not perceived as an exterior fear, but it's perceived as though every day could only get worse. This could be the critical Hobbesian point. There's a shadow of fear that, if once surpassed, it's impossible to listen to the voice of reason and listen to peace. Once we're past the shadow, the only thing possible as a sign of life, that is, of survival, is rebellion, is violence. Not violence as that which is opposed to reason, but the only reason left. So here was the image that I was showing. They robbed so much from us that they robbed our fear. It's one of the slogans repeated during this outburst. The straw that broke the camel's back was a very small fare hike that, at the end of the day, represented no more than 4 cents US dollars but however, in the most expensive metro system in Latin America. Secondary school students that by 2006 had pushed forward the greatest mobilizations in the history of the country, the Penguin Revolution for the right to education. They started a campaign for the boycott. This call had an effect that was felt massively, jumping the turnstiles that are only moved with the metro ticket, laughed in the face of an incredibly vast subterranean system. The call and its subsequent action exceed the effects that were reached in 2011. with the demand for quality public education. It's not hard to see why. It's not difficult to understand why once things are in sight. Free school is precisely a demand. It has power in and of itself, and it must be fulfilled. This boycott is not a demand, it's an execution. It is an executive power. In 2011, by the way, the structure and performativity of protest changed without changing its reivindicative sense, taking on one part a carnival atmosphere and enriching the message and creativity. Citizen appeal to this movement and its demands, as you remember, reached the peak of 80% support. But the most decisive thing of that 2011 movement was transforming common sense. And a change in common sense is one of the greatest consequences in socio-political terms, a la Gramsci. Only a few months before the beginning of the 2011 protests, almost no one had listened to the idea of free education at the university level. As much as you might think it excessively onerous to pay this much money, and perhaps it had no relationship to the quality of education offered, the idea of paid public education provided by the state could sound, if not contradictory, at least equivocating. There was the naturalization of the neoliberal credo of consumer goods, invoked during President Piñera's crisis. It's obvious. So the defendants of the system, that if university education assures important economic returns to graduates, they should pay for their education and fulfill this debt, because they have been benefited from this very same education. Shortly, this idea, strictly solidary idea, identifying the student as a client, was destroyed with 3 pieces of evidence. 1, education is a social right. 2, public education cannot imply a cost for those who use it. Rather, it should be financed by the state as its responsible party. And 3, it's important to assure the quality of the education that's being given. So common sense coincided with this demand. Public, free, quality education in a country where everything has to do with consuming things at good market prices, from the most elemental until it finally overlapped with the idea of free education. But boycott touches the 2 most sensible nerves of the system, corruption and collusion, on this idea that privileges are reached through criminal or at least ethically impresentable conduct. The accumulation of evidences, things like price increases of things so basic as toilet paper, and garnering favor among high-up corporate representatives, fiscal evasion. This added on to the cases of abuse and rape by the Catholic Church to mine the public's trust in any of the fundamental institutions of the country. Precisely in a country where this trust is part of the identity of the population. So the most paradigmatic figure of this behavior was the President of the Republic. As I said before, different from the names invoked in 2011, boycott doesn't just designate an action, it carries it out. It is a performative, curiously, surely, because it combines imperative and invitation. So you say, you have the initiative, you don't need to wait until for someone to respond or interpolate. No one else but yourself. On the other hand, it has a revealing character, boycott, right? This is how the country works at the point of boycott. So take action with your hands, use your body, jump the turnstile to dismantle the same workings of the system. As a result, it is at the same time a questioning and a parenthesis of the agent that has the authority and the means to satisfy this demand, to reject it or negotiate. You could talk about a radical interruption of the principle of sovereignty until all decision is concentrated particularly in a system as presidentialist as Chile. Boycott is returning to sovereignty to who primarily and substantially has it, or rather, the people, right? So one word, one name, a specter that not even the Constitution, the consolidation of the dictatorship could have erased. Probably because the established power interrupts not even its dignity, but the very initiative. It reacts excessively with actions that evoke the dictatorship. However, the population rebels. Repression becomes paroxystic. Probably everywhere it is like this, but in Chile, something about repression, violence by the hands of the state, and the reiterated violation of human rights ends up in horrendous mutilations. In the dictatorship, it was the hitting, the burning, the cut, the triad of punishment that you can look up on in Plato. In 2018, it's eyes. Destroying the eyes of protesters by rubber bullets pointed directly at the face by the police force to blind. You could stop to interpret, to extract consequences, and think of the symbolism, turning a brutal fact into a metaphor. It has been done, and I will not do so. Interrupting the installed sovereignty, many observers does not derive, however, in anarchy. It is rather a reivindication, an act of the original sovereign, the people, not folks, not citizenry, not the mass, not the multitude. These are words that constrict or exaggerate. I was talking about the people, like as a specter. So you can begin to resent institutional power when what that name invokes is some kind of corporeal and present massivity. People, a specter. Some kind of charismatic leadership could have conjured it, which has happened so many times, if not amongst us. Somewhat, some charismatic leader that can invoke the most condemned leaders of the SS. In any case, it's an other with a capital. The First Lady, Cecilia Morel, with a very tender sincerity, talked about aliens, talking about the masses congregating in plazas. With a similar innocence, she said to a friend, I guess we're going to have to reduce our privileges and share with the rest. Clearly, this is the way in which a closeted class with these very same privileges tends to think of everyone else, of the cabal, the rest, right? But I'm interested in that very radically other aliens, people seen from the higher echelons of power, alleging, as the president did 2 days after the outburst, that this is a war against a powerful and implacable enemy, suggests that this outburst and its violence has been machinated from abroad. These are other components of this miserable mythology. Alien has turned into people that powerful and implacable enemy. From another point of view, the greatest danger that this word encircles, people, it designates something substantial, something that possesses a certain ontological density. People, I've said in other places, is a fiction. And we know what is the power of fiction when you believe in it, knowing that it is fiction. Its strength is the strength of pure potential. Potential as potential. When I was talking about a reivindication in the act that in its own sense has no subject, because this supposed subject is none other than the potential of the people people as potential. I was referring precisely to this. The reivindication exerted massively in the street is an act of potential that embodies and is made present and at the same time that is being exercised. Time is an essential fact for this potential, and it affirms itself as potential and the diverse affluence of who converge and sustain this affirmation. This is why the act of this potential as potential has the trait of an assembly and at the same time of a co-presence. This comes from assemblée in French, to group together, that at itself derives from Latin assimilare, which has the word simul, which means at the same time. I'm sharing these facts, precedents, not as a way to call them in. I don't know how they've converged. And I stop here for a moment, too. Everything is registered, each participant, a cellular with the capacity to document and share everything that happened there, here, in this or another moment. In the course of certain situations and incidents, it has been stamped in the walls of the city and in every surface able to receive the appearance of a certain figure, a slogan, or traces of a rapid signature. Images, slogans, songs, clamors, bursts, fights, fires, scenes of pain, anguish, joy, bodies and faces exerting the right to presence. Protest and the march possess a capacity to self-document in real time, the same way in which social media has shared the call to marches, the greatest in Chile, testifying to what has happened in the now as it is happening. From many points of view, as the protest is becoming imminent, it's an essential component to the contemporary form of street-based gatherings. This makes images a determining piece in the transitory self-construction of a popular collective. But the question is, how does it operate? How does it work as an image? The circulation of images through the network, with everything that goes with it, emojis, opinions, commentaries, interruptions, whatever you like, and with the alterations that can be inflicted on it, occurs ideally, or if you prefer, and this moment can happen imaginarily, on a horizontal plane that knows no limit, more than likes or dislikes, the reactions that they can evoke. The reproductions, resends, in a way that does not has no repercussions on its visual quality or its contextual signs. This horizontality, this media horizontality confirms or reflects a counter-hierarchical horizontality, if I can call it that. This is a characteristic of the current protests. There is, at the same time, a kind of anarchy and becoming in the multiplication of the images. This anarchy and imminence reflect the constitutional mode of the multitudinous street-based assembly. Between both, there's an inherent relationship between images and the convergence of bodies in protest. There are these codes, comic translated codes, echoing the heroes and Avengers cinema, Hollywood cinema, but without their cosmetics or their careful choreography. There are these icons, the Paramount, Nankaman, the Baila Pikachu, the Dancing Pikachu, the Purple Lady, and of course, the Black Cop Killer, a dog, the legendary street dog that came to the student mobilizations of 2011, immortalized with its red bandana around its neck. And along with Washington and Condorito, probably the primordial figures of Chile. These glorious images on the front line show the poses, the gestures of the great cinematographic epic, but at the same time they make its strict vulnerability evident. The absence of any special power. There could be anything but the exposed body ready to fight. It maintains I can't deny how much this has changed my perception and my opinion of these people. In many occasions, I expressed my rejection, my suspicions, my irritation of the so-called hooded ones. I had close understandings of different actions that I used to think disgusting. I was irritated by their visible organization, and they didn't have properly political ends, not a strategy based on union and cohesion. But this front line, multiple testimonies, observations, commentaries, the efficient actions, the multiplication of the hoods, this changed my mind. I'm not signing a blank check, but these hooded ones are there, fighting for what matters to all of us. And this is where the disconcerting element comes in, the blind street, where the left is scattered everywhere, this blind street where all the protesters gather. This is the home of the people. A condition, as I was insinuated, the people is a fiction, a spectrum, a phantasm that that runs through everything. It's everywhere and nowhere. And it is at the same time an apparition in which we base our hope, our faith, our desire of a community and its immanence. But what does the image imagine? What do we imagine an image to be? What does the image do with itself? It's not enough to ask what the image of the image is, though this question can never be suppressed. It's not the same to say in this case, and maybe in every case. It's about the circulation of images, their movement, the movement from one to the other, as well as the becoming of the image as an image. This last implies the moving of an image, that one image gives way to another. In other words, any image is a step. It doesn't exhaust itself in and of itself. It is never fully fulfilled. It's its own entity, regardless of lighting focus. It opens up and refers to other images unlimitedly. This is the mediality of image. Every image is in the middle, is a medium for other images, as it becomes an image. This movement, this transit, is not an image, or rather it is any image possible, which is the same, to say the same thing. Neither is it imaginable. One thing needs to be emphasized firmly. Everything that I've said, all these twists and turns, refer to faculties of the subject or the capacity of the psyche. If I say any image gives way to another, in one image, if not contained, it is alluding to, or it suggests a plethora of other images. You immediately think of mnemonic or associative fluxes that have their place in a subject or in a mind. If I say imaginable or unimaginable, you assume that this ability or impossibility is something that happens or is dependent on aptitude or ability that is one's own. Imagining that something does and has its limit in the imaginative power that someone has. In general, that this power is possessed by the whole community, the congregation of all of the spirits. I don't understand it as such. If I say imaginable or unimaginable, I talk about image becoming an image as something that is inherent to it, with the precedence of subjects or minds in which this becoming happens, or in which this becoming depends. This is the sense that the idea of movement, of transiting from one image to another, has in its becoming image. It's not an image, neither is it imaginable. The Platonic fear of bad mimesis, that is, rhetoric, the philosopher, the painter, the cosmetologist, the candy maker, but above all, the poet. There is an essential knowledge in that about a certain kind of autonomy, and even a kind of autocracy of the image. The painter and the poet have the rare ability. The painter and the poet have the rare ability to separate the image from the thing itself, giving an anomalous ontological subsistence, and from this, turn it from a place from which to judge, and produce this very same thing, which will never again be itself, nor will evoke its same ideal. Doubling it, unfolding the real as it becomes unrecoverable in its double. But painter and poet have always been preceded by this primordial agency that has even suggested to artisans the models or evocations of its production, and the feces, the source, the root. Trees and leaves, are they not reflected in the mirror of the water? The animal who hunts, the animal who senses fear, are there imprints in the horrible scene of the hunt? The myriad voices, screams, echoes, do they not all echo in the forest? The folding already happened, and it persists. The image, its creature, it's its cause. It's terrifying to think of all the multiple, interminable implications that happen without the presence of a human witness, or no. Do you always need to have some kind of someone for which a shadow exists, an echo, an imprint? Is there a mirage that goes unseen? This question is not innocuous for a country where nothing happened, where an oasis, a mirage, surrounded the desert, surrounded us. The perception is very interesting. It's not just belong to who has it. It also calls in the exterior. It is an in-between place. It's the medium through which nature, and I keep calling it such. Perception is its own thing as well. So the echo, the reflection, shadow belong to it. And it becomes and emerges, it presents itself, whether something is there or not. Feces unfolds. And maybe there is a third or a fourth specter, shame. It's not mainly the perception of a subject. Perception, in fact, is before all of this, is before the subject. In a certain way, Plato was the first thinker on transmediality. But the issue is, how do we think of this trans? I'm trying to suggest what I am able to see. That's why I insist on the autonomy of the image. It is available for any use and service, with perfect indifference, hiding its secrets. I insist on the double determination of perception, always claimed by what is perceived, and from where things are perceived. I insist on the flux that show the light, the shadow, the anxious reverberation. I insist on this flux. In Spanish, we call the space or time, the space and time in which this flux occurs, and what makes possible entre medio, in between. According to our standard dictionary, the one of the Royal Spanish Academy, this implies what is in the middle of two extremes. However, following the definition of the RAE, entre en medio, between and middle, together seem redundant. Alternatively, what is in between the two extremes also is not terribly mined, this definition. But this is a perhaps productive redundancy. Entre medio, in between, is not what is in between. It's in the same place. It's a paradoxical place, a non-place, topos, because the movement and the flow, at the same time that they confirm it, because without it these do not exist, they erase it, they consume it. Entre medio, in between, is that what is undesignable to facilitate the flow and at the same time make possible the extremes. Everything trans and everything extreme are indebted to it. No is nothing, and it's everything, or rather it's the critical place par excellence, the non-place from which you can define public space, dispersing the assembly, which points precisely to this place, usurping it, canceling it, negating it. A no follows it, guards it, closes it. Another no, not a yes, another no, a third, at the margin of all yes and of all no, conjures it. The multitude reassembles. Back to the images. About them, by the way, there's different ways to read them. We can see them as fragments, outlines, quick takes, even if they are videos, and maybe stay meandering as if in a gallery, observing with more or less attention to each image. We could intend to extrapolate from them the general context in which they're each inscribed. They're not just fragments, they are moments, that is, momentum, the instance of acceleration that is incommensurable with any other, even if all are participants in a happening in which they are slivers, and it is impossible to reconstitute based on what we can observe, because we don't know the laws of their relationship, the law that's missing, the form of the law that at the same time is coming and is subtracted from each image. In this announcement and subtraction, there exists the promise of a totality, but it's radically different from that which the spirit that intimately remembers, inert, right? Hegelian reference, assumes and appropriates without subtracting, or with a subtraction that always appropriates, and its slow walk through the gallery of all these figures. I'm talking about Hegel in the final paragraph of the Phenomenology of the Spirit. The totality in this case announces and subtracts despite appearances in the impetus. It is not a telos. It is not the consummation or a feint or a counterfeit. The totality is there always, fugitive in each moment. In every momentum is promise, yes, but a promise that is kept without being consumed in the momentum, indecisive, improbable, impossible, but always possible in its same impossibility. That is to say, imminent. Imminence is time, is promise is time. There are perhaps different names for this totality. If we think in the mass demonstrations, gestures, the songs, its improvised choreography, the effusion of the voices and affects, the visibility of the bodies, the multiple skirmishes with the armed forces, this characterizes Mobilization in Chile. The Mobilization in Chile is characterized by the total absence of party emblems. Chilean and Mapuche bands are the only emblems. Black Chilean flag, some black with the white star of different, we can read this different ways. Multiple colors from football clubs, football hooligans, but not in discord. Banners that express belonging, or rather a desire or an aspiration. They do something with mass mobilization very different from the declaration of previous beginnings. We don't come from anywhere. Our origin is erased and mutilated. We are perhaps bastards, children of a primordial mother that was never there, a father that did not exist. Precisely the fact that there was no. This allows the people to understand themselves as people and think of themselves as carriers of a promise that sustains its own performance until living is worth living, until dignity becomes custom. This until is the time undergirding promise. What promise is that which formulates and is part of the phrases pronounced with these affects, bodies, existence in the street? What promises circulate and are embodied by all these that are designated as people? Right? The people are the ones who now occupy the streets and the plazas, affirming a collective promise where they can start to become. It is a communist promise in the sense that it still waits. It is always still waiting. The mass is singing, or maybe a small group, maybe in the corner in a plaza. El pueblo unido, the united people, speaks of specters, not transcendental. It's not the unity of the people as a regulatory ideal, a necessary hypothesis. People is immanent. It's this earth and experience. It's the limit of all common experience to which we could aspire to, and the always open frontier of the earth without walls, without fences. I insist it's a promise, never, will never be defeated. Measures the magnitude of this promise. But the images, what I try to think of as the motion, the movement, the momentum of the image, and the images, the trends, and the in-between, the images of the march, of the assembly, of the protest, of the mass protest, of the multiple skirmishes with the repressive agents, are not just images of, to think of it as a visual archive, as a register, as a testimony. They are references to each other and are the mode itself of street-based assembly. They are also defined by the trans movement and in between. What matters is space, sometimes minimal, between one body and the next, between one passion and the next. This is the space of encounter, the very possibility of a commons where nothing common could have happened. This is the promise. This is the possibility. Everything is registered. The clashes, the street fights, the proliferation of fires, many of them of doubtful origins, the selective destruction of buildings, pillaging and looting, the population's extreme repression by police, bloody bodies, mutilations. If they are not registered, they're documented, quantified, litigated, the humiliating naked bodies, the tortures, the rapes. The generic word, of course, is violence. I was talking about promises. It's a demanding time because it demands for time beyond this time's closure. This time doesn't come without cost. All those who seek for its closing do so through violence. And so it seems to be that the time of the promise, that is, the time in which they act, those who make an effort to maintain it, it is definitely the time of violence. And often it is. There where violence is exerted and suffered again because it is exerted. But one and the other are not the same violence, or said another way, cannot be called to the same terms. Must we talk about violence? It's absolutely necessary. There's no subterfuge. Wherever you go, and in mouths of almost everyone is talking about, I'm talking about Chile. I'm condemning violence. I'm condemning violence in all of its manifestation. I'm condemning violence no matter where it comes from. They're quick phrases, undeliberate, automatic, as though they were said by an irrefutable imposition. So if you're not condemning it, then you're allowing it. Why would you hesitate to say that you don't justify it? So we must condemn violence. But of course, this requirement, this imposition that does not admit a replica, is said by a government and an exasperated right, tired of cornering its political adversaries, pushing them to the end of the rink. And some of these adversaries give in to the imposition. Many are part of this condemnation without any nuance. The figure is pathetic and sometimes dangerous and is considered at a far distance scandalous, as is the imposition of obeying. And it's important to disobey it. In any other way, we could fall in confusion or error that have serious consequences, and the same imposition is violent. There's a dominant discourse in Chile that is summaried by phrases and is pushed by the government that imposes police and repressive measures, mixing it all up: protest and looting, protest, vandalism and pillaging, crime and revindication. It's a way to hide the evidence of abuse, exclusion, marginalization, cornering the conditions of life to the very edge of the possible in these systems that govern our lives day by day. It's not occasional violence, it's constant. And legitimize human rights violation and crimes against humanity perpetuated by agents of the state. That infringe the rule of law constantly. If we must talk about violence, we must be discerning, minimally discerning. I'm interested in this requirement to condemn. What does it say? It says, don't think. There is no space for doubt. In backtracking, don't think. This is a particularly capricious and violent form of violence that is camouflaged as repulsion and sanctions the worst forms of repression, even the horror and murder that the state, organisms of the state have engaged in, and secures the monopoly of force. Don't think. Violence is unthinkable. That's the start. You could start to speak on that from that point. Violence, unthinkable. In what context? Obviously not in all contexts. In fact, in most historical, political, social contexts are made up of sanctioned forms of violence, institutionalized, ritualized, some of which persist today in cultural environments of different kinds. Forms and practices that are not considered violent, as we think of them in the spontaneous sense today, under the weight of imposition, applying force with the intention to harm, destroy, coerce. In the context of democracy, we are able to think of the idea of violence as unthinkable, not because it happens constantly, but rather because apparently democracy and violence are mutually exclusive. Democracy, ideally, establishes conditions to resolve all conflicts and any kind of dispute by nonviolent means, and should have, in its concept and principle, an allergic reaction to violence. But democracies are not necessarily their own concept or their own principle. Violence happens in them not as a threat or as an attempt against stability or the regime, the democratic regime, or as a legitimate force to protect one or another, but also as a regular rule of existence, of certain existences. It is logical to ask what happens betwixt intermedio, violence and democracy. Democracy that and violence is that which they say breaks and finally destroys democracy that they speak about and that they only speak about. It makes sense that we would ask about the relationship between violence and democracy, because the democracy they speak about is sustained on violence, a deaf and constant violence. Then when it is contested with what they sometimes call vandalism, though this can only designate the right to get together, protest, and resist repression, immediately jumps to the protesting that particular kind of violence, vandalism. But that violence, that other, that explodes when you make the violence on which it rests visible and which democracy feeds off of. What violence is this other form of violence? From the first day of the awful Piñera regime, we are at war, he said, as he responded to these manifestations. We are not at war. The protesters, the front line insisted, we are not the violent ones, we are the resistance. And it's important to point this out. The violence that eventually happened in the protests and the concentrations operates on things. The violent repression of the government against people. That is, private property and public property that was oftentimes treated as private property. This is worth more than people, the people who protest and who are latently criminalized for the fact of even protesting. And it's precisely protest, how you want it done and how you want it executed, has a latent reference to violence. It is contained particularly in all those who demand to not continue to be excluded, to be permanently victimized, to maintain a system that depends on precarity and denies life and dignity. Dignity, yes, is the word that converges all the affects and thoughts of this outburst. Dignity is what has been screamed from Plaza Baquerano and from the center of the concentrations.
Entre paréntesis, no estoy ni ahí, era la frase consagrada del 90, refunfuñada sobre todo por una juventud marginada y discriminada.
I'm not even there was a phrase circulated in the 1990s by a marginalized and discriminated youth that did not see another horizon for its life. Now the phrase is, let's give it all. If not, then what are we doing? Being there, saying, manifesting. Hannah Arendt famously defined violence by its instrumentality, for its quality as a medium to secure certain ends, in the express interest of dissociating it essentially from power. I'm more interested in understanding it as Benjamin does, thinking of it as a means, as the beginning. But I'm also interested in thinking of that protest moment, right, that is present as a myth in Benjamin, as a sort of vestibule, the beginnings of which violence is made possible. But this is where we can talk about instrumentality as well. The most dangerous thing of social mobilization, the protest, is that it becomes captured and subsumed under this generic violence. And this is the fundamental stigma that the established power wants to imprint on it indelibly. And this can happen from the inside as well. There can be actions taken from within the street-based assembly that can give fodder to stigma. The danger, what's in this game, is from passing from a state of violent democracy that actually restricts rights, extends the repertoire of acts considered criminal, criminalized determined behaviors, and even ways of presenting in public. For instance, the law against vandalism, the law against hooded people, that criminalizes those who cover their faces in protest. And finally, that gives a level of immunity that is impunity to the actions of the police. And this is the state that we're incubating. I'm wrapping up. What happened if thinking on democracy, the affirmation and defense of democracy, could think of us to rethink violence radically? What would happen if violence was inherent to democracy as an original and insuperable tension? What would happen if democracy was a program sustained from the reduction of violence in all its forms? And it is, certainly. But does there need to be necessarily an essential original relationship between democracy and violence? The horizon of democracy is not the reduction of violence, rather its translation, precisely in the moment in which it is deemed to be possible. The outburst has made emerge from its very fact, from its very base, a breaching in established social order, the way social relationships are regulated and administered. This vacuum makes possible a rearticulation unthinkable before. It is a vacuum and the same as suspense of the regulated normal temporality, of the regulated temporal norm regulated by work and consumption that suggests a radically different temporality whose index, if we can say so, is transitory. In this vacuum and suspense, in this in-between, there is still the specter called people, as well as the inherent, indelible possibility of violence, if the people can be thought of as a subject, and it is not because of its diversity, its variation, and constitutive aperture. It would be the subject, this point of conversion, of translating violence in and of itself as an alternative and a strangeness, the primordial strangeness of everything human and everything other human. So this last image is actually a video. I think I have to give it more time. I don't know how to make this thing work. There we go. Can you hear it?
Tras el vidrio empañado, sin saber quiénes son, dónde van. Pienso
Bueno, eso es. Gracias.
I'll do it in Spanish and I'll translate, or people can ask in Spanish and or in German, you know. So, questions? Pablo, thank you. Is there a microphone? Oh no, there's for the recording. Microphone.
Do you need to speak on the phone?
I'm going to try to be coherent because the talk was very rich and I'm jet lagged, and I have a question, comment that could be expanded in various directions, but I wanted to go back to the section on the image. Maybe invite you to speak a little more specifically on the moment of the becoming of the image. You quickly identified a moment that it is not an image in and of itself. And I was wondering if part of the problem of the apparatic nature of the situation, for instance, with the danger of democracy, it's a different route, right? This could be about the relationship between images of democracy, the democracy of images. If part of the apparatic nature lies in the fact that it is always possible that the non-imagistic moment of the image can appear as image, and therefore we can have a much greater difficulty then in following its tracing of the movement of the image becoming an image, because in and of itself it is already an image, a kind of image. So it does not allow us a moment of exteriorization that would allow perhaps being able to capture what is an image, what is not an image. What I think this puts us in the space in which it forces Plato to exclude mimesis at its root, because this unfolding of mimesis that you were speaking of, it is already operating in the image itself. So I don't know. From there, I wanted to ask you about the mythical issue, because it communicates with that, right? In the way in which mythical, there's always something mythical about protesting, and it manifests itself as something original. This absolute mother that will never abandon you. It will never free you from ties to a kind of prehistorical past, primordial past. If there's not a kind of persistence, more dangerous persistence of that mythology of the image, the moment in which we open ourselves to think of the becoming of the image, this imagistic point of the image. That's like the first initial question. I have many other. I thought it was, I'm going to need whole weeks, right, to digest this, but that was my first question. How do you want to?
Gracias, Ronald.
Thank you, Ronald.
I
have a confession. I started to take notes at the end of November. Right, a month had happened since all this happened, like a month and a half. I was in Paris when the protests started on October 18th. I was in Paris. I came back that Sunday, and there was a state of emergency in Santiago. The first thing that happened, right, how do I understand this? How do we understand this? And the first question was, like, is it necessary to understand, right? And I started to saturate myself with things that the media offered, social media, public media, newspapers, all of that, many discourses. And I thought most of them agreed on the fact that, so using categories that were already known, so to illuminate the facts that were already happening, and perhaps the facts that should put our own ability to think in question. That's a fundamental point. So I started writing notes for myself. I had no intention of publishing or communicating this to anyone, but just for me to work on that discomfort. It's an inherent discomfort because, right, this is my job, trying to understand and think these things. So I thought the first thing I'm going to do, maybe not the only thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to think about the image. The images offer me a space, an interesting space. The image can offer me a sort of resistance to my own categories and my ability to discourse on these events that the images make reference to. It was enough. Sorry, I lost in this phrase. But what I'm trying to say is, when you try to discourse on these things, it's the easiest way, right? The image makes things more difficult. So it's like a good presentation for this to suggest things as you're speaking. It's more aesthetic. Maybe it should not be. But that was my doubt about the final video, actually. It's the edge of being cheesy, of kitsch. But I was looking for, the video of a violinist. Do you know these vertical ghetto buildings in Santiago? They're these buildings that have been built pretty recently to put, immigrants and, kitchens burst open, people died with the fires. It's horrible. In one of these buildings, there's a violinist, a Chilean, who started playing one day, right? The Right to Live in Peace by Victor Jara. And people started joining in. That's what I was looking for. That's the video I was looking for. This was something that's a little bit more individual, where anything that has to do with protest goes to the second plane to offer a very beautiful image of these two hooded figures dancing together. It's too prefabricated. I couldn't avoid it. I love this Victor Jara song. But you're pointing at something that I think is absolutely central. How to find something that forces me to think. It's so impossible for you to undo all of your preconceived notions, but you can at least put them in question, right? All of these presuppositions. So that's the image. So I was trying to understand, and of course I'm not saying this in a self-reflexive way, sufficiently self-reflexive way, but this sort of image becoming image, this unlimited circularity of image from one to the other, right, a path from one image to the next, creates a kind of independence for us as subjects being able to process these images. Right, this autonomy, this Platonic autonomy that you're mentioning. That's in its nature. Nature has this, sorry, theater has this. Right, this constant becoming. This is terrifying for Plato to contemplate. It's something horrendous. But how to think about that image becoming image, moving from one image to the next, autonomously, exercising this idea of autonomy. And how does this image become an image of itself? That has to be a sort of a final closing point. Or maybe like a point of resistance, right? There must be a blind spot. Blind for me. And what you said is, I don't know if it's precise, specific, but it illuminates a lot for me. I can't think about it. I can't think about things without it now. The danger is in that, yes, I can, how can I say it, try to produce an image of that which is in and of itself an image. That's the blind spot. When I go back to my safety, all of my concepts that I know and understand of what an image is. These are probably images where I try to reconcile myself with the world. It's absolutely impossible to penetrate. And I don't know, I don't have the slightest idea, but the realist of the real, right? That point. That's what I'm interested in. And that's where I would like to seek out this issue. It couldn't be the current relationship. This democracy thing is very important. It's a kind of, how would I say this? The ability to go back to the image, the blind spot of the image. You could think about it that way too, but you have to elaborate that much more specifically and extensively. The original danger of democracy, right? It's super difficult to imagine that now. I couldn't, but I thank you for the question. I feel super illuminated by that. It forces me to think about things I hadn't been able to think about. I want to think about the relationship between time and promise. And above all this, that seems really important to me. If promise doesn't have content, specific content, we're in a situation in which, until when? The image. On the one hand, it's sad that there is the formal imperative, a promise of excluding the substantiation of the promise, so that this difference can engender the possibility of promise, of democracy. But practically speaking, a promise without substantial content and without a sufficient horizon can be too complicated. We're talking about the constituency from the constituency to constituency. This last step seems to require an image for the promise. What to do with that? What to do with that need? I think it's great what you just asked, and I thank you for that. I'm not going to be able to answer that really well, but it's very difficult. But on the one hand, there is that interdiction of making an image of that which undergirds the promise, that iconoclasm, that which could give its substance to what convenes us in the commons, because, right, there's no promise unless the promise of the commons. It executes itself, it activates itself, it creates its own performance. And that's the complications with protest. It has a euphoric moment in which the assembly or the multitude, the street-based multitude, feels fully realized. I realize it's an utopic moment in that you go home and then you still kept a kind of suspension of normal time of consumption and work. That's what I was referring to. So all these months, it's been really impressive, but there's definitely the pressure exerted by just keeping yourself alive, right? We'll go back in March really strongly. We have another plebiscite on March 27th, or April 27th. We're almost at the beginning of this plebiscite. In a situation that's really unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. I don't actually know if there's going to be a plebiscite. It's a very complex issue. In a government that's in a situation of desperation. We're on vacation right now, so. But just wait until March, and then everything will be exacerbated. It'll be even more frustrated, and the multitude, of course, will be much more indignant. It's been that way up until now, because the political forces in the country have not been able to take responsibility of even the most elemental demands that have been made. They don't understand them, or they don't want to. That this is not something solved by individual solutions or local solutions. And then there's that constitution demand, right? Redo the Constitution. as Julio was mentioning. Reading the Constitution does seem weird. We're super legalists in Chile. Like, you're a republic, right? Argentinians and Italians can live without a government. We cannot. We need institutions. But what I do think is important is, a little bit what I was saying at the beginning. You're asking for a new constitution. One, let's change the rules of the game. They're abusive for most of us in the country. Two, we're changing the rules, not you. That's why I'm saying this is not a demand. It's an act. It's an execution. It's the original executive power. So that's why people are in an uproar about the constitutional assemblies, or the constitutional convention as the parliament calls it now. There's certainly a problem there, and it's a problem has to do with destitution, constitution, and institution. And I can't eliminate that from the horizon, the institution, right? I like institutions, I confess. They matter to me. It depresses me that Chile's institutionality is in such bad conditions. It's really unseemly. But I don't know if I could call it like a kind of preservation, conservation, or reemergence of a memory of democracy. I would call it that. In the sense that democracy, it's never something stable or established. The radicalization of democracy, if it's not radicalized, if it's not profound, it's not democracy. You have to keep that memory alive. I'm interested in that phrase. That valga la pena vivir, until dignity becomes custom, until it's worthwhile to live. These are slogans that echo the memory of democracy and the preservation of that memory. Right? What are we talking about with all of this? When we say democracy, we're talking about dignified lives, right? It's easy. It's basic, sorry. These dignified lives do exist. Or they demand certain kind of institution, not any kind of institution. Some way to administer these institutions and make them work. And propose solutions to people's problems. We're saying, we're not even saying that democracy, we're not even saying that we want democracy to be inclusive, because certain kinds of inclusion always imply exclusion. We're going to have to exclude someone, right? We're saying a non-exclusionary democracy has to do with that. An emergence or re-emergence or preservation of democracy, always as the deepening of democracy, of memory of democracy is always deepening. But it's super fragile. We're experiencing the fragility today. We're experiencing it with great anxiety. We don't know what's going to happen. I'm very afraid in terms of what's going to happen. Things could get very ugly in Chile, and the right is very worried about what another faction of the right is doing, and the other right is afraid that we're being manipulated by the other faction of the right to a situation in which the government becomes extremist and relies on the armed forces and relies on the militarization of the country. In the current context, for that right, the first right that I was mentioning, this could turn into a civil war for them. It's not so easy to send the army into the street and to not have that army do its own thing. So that right becomes unreasonable. But I think that fear is present. That fear also has to do with the points in which you can and have to talk with the right. That right, who at least is a little bit more open. Obviously, we're talking about negotiations and moments that go through different kinds of routes. You can't imagine the country constituting itself without a right wing. The right, it's inescapable. As a social, political force, a way of life, cultural power. As democratists, we have to think about that too. 3 questions, and you answer them, you throw them out all at once, and then you can answer them. Tarek, Riley, and Natalia. I want to go back to this idea of the image becoming image. I would like you to clarify a couple of different things. You said the people is a promise, and it's a promise that is always imminent, and it's always a potential. I liked how you connected this to the idea of image as transit. And then to ask a question, would it be possible for you to think about the image not only as an immaterial form, a new formulation of amorphism, or amorphous matter, but think of the image not as a social contract, or at least a reconfiguration of the social contract, but that would lead us to a definition of the people as a promise, as you were saying, but as something that has a non-isomorphic relationship with the national territory. I would like to hear you talk a little bit about that. What is the relationship between this excess that we refer to as image with this new kind of relationship that's possible or impossible? But for me, that's anarchy. Communism, not communism, right? This is a tension. You understood me, right? Okay. I have to write this down. I'm going to write it down. Next question? Sure. I'm going to try to make my question coherent. Thank you so much for your presentation. There was a question that you repeated throughout the presentation. Choreography. The word choreography. And I was interested in that concept in relation to the image that you showed at the end. Choreography as well as dance, right? Because dance studies, right? Dance is a text that exceeds, amplifies, or resists social norms. Sovereignty. And I'm interested in the word or the concept of choreography because it's been a good part of this movement. And I was thinking about it also in relationship to the militarized movement of police and armed forces as a counterpoint. To talk about how you think about choreography, especially if choreography or dance specifically introduces a different sensory dimension, affective dimension, another kind of common sense, another kind of will, common will. I'm thinking of Rousseau here. In civil society that displaces state terror. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pablo, for that beautiful presentation. I wanted to know if you thought you want to maintain these categories of people and democracy. Maybe at the end you said, well, look, I'm an institutionalist. So I wanted to maybe take that back up, something that I listened to, at least in Jack's question. Maybe it's a shadow, I'm not sure. This issue of the promise, the promise of what emerges in these protests, like that which Spinoza said, no one knows what a body can do, which is there's an echo. No one knows what a body can do. It's not what
creo que por lo menos la historia de aquello que también llamamos democracia,
of that which we also call
que a fin de
democracy,
cuentas,
which at the end of the day,
la forma prevalente y en
it's
Chile en
the
particular,
main way,
como gran
especially in
modelo, una
Chile,
democracia liberal.
a liberal
Y me
democracy,
pregunto
a
si
great model,
esa potencia de esos
possibility
cuerpos, que
of
yo
these
preferiría no
bodies,
llamar pueblo, pero
that I would prefer not to call people, but if you call them people, that's fine. Maybe because you want to maintain democracy.
Si tiene que devenir democracia.
Does democracy have to become? Yeah, okay, great. You touched a sensitive spot. Okay. If it's too sensitive, you don't have to touch it. You can just not answer. I'll try. I might stutter, but stuttering says something. Yes, this first question has to do with that too. What you were asking about. I don't know how to think about this. These relationships. So I'll go back to saying about the image, right? Why I was interested in the image. I don't know if I'm always interested in the image, but I'm interested. In this case, I was interested, particularly because of the resistance. I was talking about the not imaginable moment, the unimaginable moment of the image becoming itself. I was talking about the non-conceptual moment that we cannot conceive of. It's an inconceivable. This image of resistance is inconceivable. Maybe that's why I was so interested in the image, to start to analyze this moment. And this has to do with political status. This political status, this particular unimaginable moment. When I say unimaginable moment, image of itself, I'm talking about, you talk about Heidegger, about Benjamin. We could think about it in that way. I don't want to think about it that way. I want to think about it as tension between the unimaginable, the unconceptual. They're the same thing. And of course, they think about Hegel, who's somewhere in between. That this has a political nature, where the mutual claim of communism and anarchism converge. Right. Half of my heart is an anarchist heart, so I can't give that up either. Right. I can't also get rid of the idea of social devastation, but institutionality. This is a contradiction. I can't talk about right now. It's a way of dealing with this contradiction. I can understand it as a personal contradiction, as a deficit, in fact. But there's something even more basic about this way of personally experiencing that contradiction. Something that stops being personal, that has to do with the relationship between the two. The common communism and common anarchism. They're indissociable, but they're also intolerable between each other. It's a leftist problem. It's a great problem on the left that really wants change. That's fundamental. And in that sense, let's think way beyond that. Right? Social contract is it's a tie. It's a tie in regards to the possibility between extending the contract beyond its even available possibilities, which would be the extension of democracy. I don't know if you can say it this way, but a time begins, Locke, Hobbes, right? Social contract. Kant is there too. Of course, it's a great way to think. It's also a promise. And that promise has a certain sense, a certain meaning. But What it offers is something like, you know, what Hobbes was evoking. When fear becomes intolerable, and reason stops responding to anything besides its immediate input in state of nature. And when your desires put your life in very serious danger, then you have fear as a major passion that silences all other passions. So, that's a rational way of processing conflict. Or competition, right? The state of war in society. If you think of a horizon, a more contemporary horizon, in terms of the social contract, this is where the social contract is no longer possible. What is left as a sole solution in terms of socializing the community is the ecstasy of the masses. That's the difference from what I was saying, right? Fascism, right? That's fascism. Fashion is the rational solution. When reason doesn't give you the ability to articulate social relationships, but it's a drastic solution, but it's drastically rational. As you could see that in Nazism. But I think beyond the social contract, there's the fundamental ideas of democracy. Okay, so let's restart the social compact, the social contract. Okay, but what social contract? If you say found it again, then that means let's think beyond the social contract, and that's a main issue for the left that is not even able to deal with it, to risk itself, to think these things, because thinking about these things carries a risk. That's why I'm saying this touches a very sensitive spot for me, because it's also the point at which I'm trying to understand, if you want to say, right, this Spinozian phrase. Right, no one knows what a body is, but I'm not going to identify it, but okay, no one knows what's going to happen in Chile. That has to do with what a body can or cannot do. No one knows. This has a very terrifying shadow, a shadow that suppresses basic conditions for democracy that you would want to exist. When I say I'm an institutionalist, because I want there to be basic conditions. These are the only things that assure that a change can happen, that can assure a deepening of democracy. What I'm afraid of is the disappearance of these basic conditions. All right, I'm narrating this horror film because Chile is a very weird country. It's a very strange country, but it's a country that I think is interesting in terms of consciousness it has acquired in regards to very diverse situations that have converged. The feminist movement, it was super key, and the Mapuches. These are the two. The feminism was the loudest, and Mapuches much less, but the feminists were loud enough for people to realize that they were demanding things with great things for a long time, which was no more abuse, right? That's kind of what it was about. That's where everything converges. All the events that you're trying to frame your life around, the situation of your own life around. How do I say this? The consciousness that you must find solutions and exit strategies that have to do with the rules of the game. It's something that I think maintains a potential collapse at bay. Or at the brink, sorry. And I'll say this really broadly. If you look at what has happened in Chile, the protests, the masses in the streets, the state repression, it's made me think about Argentina and the way the dictator force was expressed during the dictatorship. It was very selective. 3,000 detained, disappeared, or murdered, or, you know. It was obviously much less than in Argentina. Here you would also say there's also been a kind of selectivity in repression. There was no death that can be attributed to the protesters. There have been deaths which are definitely attributed to the police, and others which are debatable, and the burnings of the supermarkets, and there was, you know, gendarmerie there. There were things that were strictly selective. They aim for the face, right? We have to blind these people. It's so obvious that there was instructions to do that, but it's selective instruction. You don't have as many deaths, right? Very cynically. So many things have happened, some people in the street, millions of people in the street, and how many dead people? Oh, like 100 people dead or whatever. It's not that many, right? It's not many people for an uprising of this nature. What I'm trying to say is that there's also an administration of violence that is calculating the effects that this violence has on the population. So this is contentious, right? One side or another. It creates, it gives an unknown quality to encounters between police and protesters, but there's a limit to that. And within that same limit, there are radical limits. Yes, what a body can do, that resonates with what you're saying. It's like the moment of danger of the promise itself. The promise of the danger of the promise being fulfilled. Because you don't want the promise to be fulfilled. It's the very last thing you want. All you want to do is keep the promise. So it's super interesting what you posed. For me, and very interesting too, or very important too. The choreography? Yeah, without a doubt. In 2011, with the protests at the universities, when they were demanding quality, free education, there was a change in protests in Chile. You hadn't seen this carnival-esque atmosphere. It's been called carnival, party, choreography. And that's where you saw dancing and music. And people underestimate this, right? The power of dance. Yeah, you can underestimate me and my ability to dance. It has an affinity for the color gray. Right, this is worse in Santiago with the pollution and the smog and all that, but gray. There was an important change, which was this kind of interruption of color and carnival and choreography, really well done. That let you know that there had been certain previous work, right? Like a thesis statement. I didn't share them for very specific reasons, but it's important to not put that on the stage. But what I'm saying is that there was a change in the form of protest. A way that has something that has to do with that collective that meets on the street, a way in which they assume themselves. And this is a country that is so very limitedly embodied. When you go to Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, or whatever, there is a relationship to the body. In Chile, it's a country that was created through hits, through punches. It was formed through discipline. And the Germans came and they reorganized the Chilean army, and as a whole, and to give us, inject us even more discipline, because the only way to maintain all of the broken Chileans, all these popular sector Chileans, to keep them in line was through force, was through punishment by force. A country raised with this discipline. This is a really interesting moment, because it's a moment in which this very same popular collective that has been so heavily disciplined through consumption, through debt, through limited possibilities of subsistence or survival for much of the population. It has acquired a consciousness, I'll use that word, an awareness that they are not just receptacles, passive receivers of certain effects done onto them, but they are able to exercise executive power. They are executioners in that way. So jumping the turnstile, I couldn't even begin to interpret that symbolically. But I'm interested in that symbology, or that symbolic relationship, because this puts what I think we should think about at risk. It leaves me uncomfortable. I do think you need to keep insisting on that which is not metaphor, cannot be made into metaphor or symbolized. That which cannot be made into metaphor or symbol, but is doable, is performative, performable. Protest. It's not just protest. It's mass protest, 1,000, 1,000,000 people. These little encounters too. The minimal of an encounter. A minimum encounter. Encounters that express, I don't know how to say this, a way to maintain conditions, life conditions, that are minimally dignified. In many cases, thousands of cases, where these life conditions have been threatened radically. Just when I was saying something about this, think of the elderly, the women who work, and the husband who works, and what happens with the children, and the neighbor. My family helps me to take care of the grandmother or the grandfather. These are solidarity networks that have been created. And so you're right in saying this hadn't happened. This wouldn't happen the way it happened if these solidarity networks hadn't been in place in the first place. This is a public performance of these solidarity networks that had already been in existence. And these are counter-neoliberal. These are exactly networks that are against the systems. So the collective is very aware of this. That neoliberalism was born and it will die in Chile. It's very public, the slogan. And this is why there have been a series of social assistance networks, we can call them that, massively. Something like this could not have happened, this encounter between one or the other, if they hadn't been in a kind of horizontality, without slogans, right, I am a member of such and such a party. They reach a point at which the hinchas of the University of Chile, I'm from Córdoba, so I know this rivalry. These soccer hooligans can protest together and hug each other. But it has to do with these networks that have been configured. And the government is very clear, the right wing is very clear, that here in this corporeality, but it's also the corporeality of image. There's a materiality to image as well, as was mentioned. The street-based image, the images that the protesters have used to construct their own histories. So yesterday, in the early morning, no one knows who, but someone erased all the images of the Gabriela Mistral Cultural Center, which was a kind of frieze that told the story of what was happening. They painted it white and red. So it's clear what's at stake here. It's interesting that the image becomes so dangerous. What did they do? They painted it white and put some red hands, right? Red handprints. So this choreography? Sorry, I'm making things up now, but what's at stake in choreography is corporeality, that moment of encounter. Let's play together, let's dance. It's also like saying, let's promise, make a promise. Let's have this promise be our own body in these acts in which these bodies adopt new behaviors, new poses than what they should be doing on a daily basis, and which have been carried out through the hits of discipline. Precisely. Objection. Sorry, it's just been me. Okay. Let's say that. No. Between that concept, which I think is beautiful, of a body as a promise, and bodies encountering each other as promise. In this Spinozian phrase, you don't know what a body can do. There's a total contradiction. Yeah, it's not an objection, it's a concern. But maybe the assembly, which is something you brought up, the assembly, when you shared the etymology of it, it's about sharing the same time, being together at the same time. The assembly is what a body can do. The body can in an assembly, because the assembly doesn't have a goal, it doesn't have a goal, a purpose, it doesn't have a direction. It's not regimented. So that's whatever the bodies can do happens. So the fact that the assembly has come to life so spontaneously in a country, which I think is so great, as you say, a country like Chile. They were little, these networks, these are little examples of an assembly. Yeah, it's very complicated. And I'm saying, don't say that. And I told myself, you're being utopic, you're being euphoric. I am a little euphoric, but I'm sorry. Yes, sorry to wrap up. So why am I so interested in this? Because I can't stop thinking of Canetti and the mass. How does Canetti think of the mass? He thinks about this in regards to Nazism and fascism. This is not a mass. It's something other than a mass. So it's not the mass that agglomerates and just behaves in one certain way. Yeah. Sorry. I'm sorry to be the cops, but this is my job right now. I'm just following orders. sorry, I'm going to erase that. Pablo, thank you so much.